Nero Claudius Caesar, once the most feared and flamboyant ruler of the Roman world, spent the last hours of his life not in the marble halls where he once commanded legions with a gesture, but stumbling through darkness like a hunted animal, stripped of his titles, his guards, and the illusions that had sustained his reign. And though he had bathed in the praise of sycophants, drowned Rome in excess, and imagined himself an immortal artist destined to reshape history, his final night revealed a fragile, terrified man clinging desperately to a crumbling identity. It began when he awoke in the palace to a silence so deep it felt unnatural. Gone were the echoing footsteps of slaves, the murmurs of attendants, the shuffle of guards. Only the hollow breath of emptiness answered his calls. Confusion turned to dread as he discovered that his most trusted servants had abandoned him, fleeing into the night. Once it became clear the Senate had declared him a public enemy. The Praetorian Guard, who had sworn to die for him, now marched for Galba, and the people of Rome, whose applause had once fueled his vanity, now celebrated his downfall with the same enthusiasm they once lavished on his performances. Panic seized Nero as he ran through deserted corridors that once overflowed with luxury. Every candle seemed to flicker in mockery. Every statue glared as though carved to witness his humiliation. The emperor, who once entered the arena to thunderous applause, now fled his own palace like a petty criminal, disguised in tattered clothes and a hood that barely concealed the trembling of his jaw. Accompanied only by a few terrified freedmen, Nero rode through the gates of Rome under the cover of darkness, flinching at distant shouts, convinced each sound signaled soldiers coming to drag him to the Forum to be beaten to death publicly. A fate the Senate had already decreed. The journey to Phaon's villa, a modest estate on the outskirts, became a humiliating testament to his fall. The emperor, who had once adorned himself in silk and gold, now clutched his disguise, slipping through muddy paths, stumbling over stones, begging the night to hide him. When he reached the villa, desperate and breathless, he collapsed inside a cramped storeroom filled with the smell of hay and mold, a place unworthy even of a servant, let alone a man who once claimed divine ancestry. Phaon and the few remaining loyalists tried to offer comfort, but every whisper carried more despair. The Senate had condemned him, the Guard had defected, and Rome had already accepted a new emperor. Nero's mind spiraled as he realized there would be no rescue, no dramatic twist of fate, no final ovation. Pacing the tiny room, he clutched his head, crying out lines from the tragedies he had once performed, as though the world should mourn his downfall as a theatrical masterpiece. He begged for someone to dig a grave in advance, terrified that his body would be left unburied, condemned to the disgrace of the damned. But no one dared move. He asked over and over again if history would understand him, if someday people would recognize his artistic genius rather than condemn him as a monster. And with each unanswered plea, his voice cracked further. When a messenger arrived announcing that the Senate had ordered his immediate execution should he be captured, Nero froze. His eyes stared blankly ahead as if he had seen his own ghost. Then, with sudden clarity turned to fear, he whispered, "What an artist dies in me!" A final cry of vanity in a world that no longer listened. His companions urged him to act quickly, fearing the soldiers drawing near. But Nero's courage was non-existent. He had spent his life celebrating violence from a distance. Yet now the mere thought of death caused his hands to shake uncontrollably. He picked up a dagger, stared at it, as though it were a poisonous creature, and repeatedly tried to press it to his throat, only to drop it each time in terror. Sweat streaked down his face, mixing with tears and dirt, as he begged Epaphroditus to help him die. But even the loyal freedman hesitated, trapped between fear of aiding suicide and fear of watching soldiers torture the emperor to death. Outside, the rhythmic thunder of hooves grew louder, echoing through the fields. Nero's breathing turned frantic as he imagined the soldiers' hands gripping him, dragging him across the forum to be beaten with rods. Before the cheering crowds, desperation transformed into hysteria as he shrieked, "Must I always be so brave?" Words drenched in irony, for bravery had never been his virtue. As the footsteps approached and his final moment closed in, he realized that no one else would end his suffering. Forcing his shaking hands to obey, he pressed the dagger against his throat once more, but even then he hesitated until Epaphroditus, moved by pity or perhaps horror, helped guide the blade. Soldiers burst in at the very moment Nero drove it into himself. Collapsing onto the floor, blood pooling beneath him, the former emperor whispered his final bitter line, "Too late! This is fidelity," believing to the last breath that he alone understood the meaning of loyalty. And so, Nero, the emperor who had demanded the devotion of millions, died with only a few frightened freedmen beside him, his body hidden in a humble villa rather than displayed in triumph or honor. His final moments defined not by glory or grandeur, but by fear, delusion, and a desperate fight to escape a death he had long earned. And in those final seconds, as the soldiers stood uncertain over whether to help or simply watch, the man who once ruled the world died, realizing the truth his mother, tutors, generals, and enemies had always known. Nero's power had been nothing but performance, and without the applause of Rome, he was nothing at all. As Nero lay bleeding on the dusty floor of Phaon's storage room, the pain radiating through his throat like fire and ice tangled together, the world he had once ruled began to collapse into blurred shapes and distant echoes. Yet death did not embrace him immediately. Instead, it lingered cruelly, forcing him to confront the very reality he had fled his entire life, a world in which he held no control, no audience, no loyal chorus to turn his final gestures into immortal art. His breath came in wet, ragged gasps, each one reminding him of the inevitable end he had tried so desperately to outrun. And as consciousness flickered in and out like a dying flame, he watched the soldiers who had just burst inside pause, uncertain, as though they were witnessing something forbidden. The mighty emperor reduced to a trembling animal, grasping at the last threads of existence. One soldier stepped forward, unsure whether to help or condemn him, but even their hesitation fed Nero's delusion that he still mattered, that even now Rome could not decide whether he should die as a tyrant or as the misunderstood visionary he had imagined himself to be. Yet the truth hung heavy in the air, thicker than the smell of blood. The empire had already moved on, and Nero's life, stretched across years of excess and cruelty, was now nothing more than a dying gasp in a forgotten storeroom. As the soldiers whispered among themselves, Nero's freedmen knelt beside him, their fear palpable. Epaphroditus pressed cloth against the wound in a futile attempt to slow the bleeding, while Phaon whispered prayers, though neither man knew whether the gods would listen, for Nero had spent his reign mocking divine order, just as he mocked the Senate and the people who had once cheered him. In his fading sight, the room warped into a confusion of shadows and memory. He saw the burning streets of Rome from years before, flames rising like serpents while he plucked the strings of his lyre. He saw his mother's accusing eyes moments before her death. He saw the countless enemies he had silenced with a gesture, and he saw his own reflection as he once wished it to be, beautiful, adored, immortal. The contrast between the fantasy and the reality trembling before him sent a tremor of despair through his dying body. With a sudden surge of delirious strength, he gripped Epaphroditus's wrist and tried to speak, but only a gurgle escaped before a whisper formed at last. Remember me as an artist. Words that dissolved into the thick air with no audience to applaud, no chronicler to record, no historian to dignify. Outside the villa, the soldiers argued over how to deliver the news. None wanted to be the one to announce that Rome's most infamous emperor had died not in battle, not in triumph, but in a puddle of blood and fear, hidden like a criminal. And as Nero's breath weakened further, the world beyond Phaon's walls shifted. Word of his death spread from whisper to marketplace, from alleyway to Senate floor, each retelling shaping him into something different. Some called him a tyrant finally punished. Others remarked on the poetic irony of an emperor undone by his own cowardice, while a few, mostly performers and slaves, spoke quietly of the moments he had shown unexpected mercy or artistic obsession that bordered on innocence. But inside the villa, Nero's final struggle continued. His fingers twitched weakly against the floor, tracing invisible patterns as though conducting one last tragic performance, while his pulse slowed to a faint flutter that even Epaphroditus could barely feel. A cold numbness crept up his limbs, stealing sensations from his fingertips, and the sounds around him, the muttering soldiers, the panicked breathing of his freedmen, the rustle of straw, faded into a distant hum. And then, with one last flicker of consciousness, he turned his eyes toward the doorway, imagining for a moment that Rome had come back for him, not to punish, but to praise, to tell him that his art had been misunderstood, that his legacy would survive, that the world would weep for his passing. But the figure standing there was no rescuer, no priest, no ally. It was one of the soldiers, a young man with dust-covered armor and uncertainty etched across his features, who stared not at an emperor, but at the pitiful shell of a man dying in agony, an image that would haunt him for years. Nero's lips parted again, struggling to form words, perhaps another desperate plea for acknowledgement, perhaps a final curse against the Senate, or perhaps a line from a play he once loved. But nothing emerged. His head fell to one side, his hand slipped from Epaphroditus's grasp, and the faint illumination in his eyes faded as though someone had extinguished a lamp. For a moment, silence consumed the room. Even the soldiers stopped breathing as they realized the man who had once declared himself a living god was gone. Then, as if released from a spell, they straightened, collected themselves, and prepared to return to Rome with the news that would reshape the empire. But the story of Nero did not end with his last breath. In the days that followed, Rome became a battleground of narratives. Some senators celebrated his death with drunken feasts, declaring that the tyrant had been purged by divine justice, while others, fearing the instability that followed, whispered that perhaps Nero's downfall had been too triumphant, too clean, too convenient. Meanwhile, among the lower classes, the actors, musicians, slaves, and foreigners who had once benefited from his extravagance, rumors began to spread that Nero was not dead at all, They claimed he had escaped, disguised himself, and fled to the east to gather an army, and that one day he would return to reclaim his throne. It was a foolish hope, born from despair and imagination, yet it grew like wildfire, fueled by countless men who later impersonated Nero in attempts to restore chaos to the empire. Even decades later, travelers in distant lands claimed to have met Nero, alive and burning with vengeance, while poets composed songs mourning his tragic fate, transforming a cowardly death into the fall of a misunderstood genius crushed by politics. And in a twist that history rarely grants tyrants, Nero's legacy became a battlefield of myth and truth. The Senate painted him as a monster. Early Christians demonized him as a persecutor. Common performers remembered him as a patron of the arts, and countless pretenders resurrected him as a symbol of rebellion. Yet, the true ending of Nero's story lies not in the myths or the legends, but in the quiet aftermath at Phaon's villa, where a small unmarked grave was dug in the early hours of the morning. His few loyal freedmen wrapped his body in simple cloth, their hands trembling as they lowered the remains of a man who had once wrapped himself in silks and jeweled robes. There were no grand speeches, no ceremonial honors, no legion salutes, only the soft rustle of earth falling over a man who had once believed the world existed to applaud him. And as the final handful of soil covered his face, a sudden breeze swept through the villa's garden, carrying with it the distant sound of a performer's lyre from a tavern far away, a haunting reminder that Nero had died not as the monster history would later describe, nor as the artistic genius he imagined, but as something far more tragic, a man who spent his entire life chasing applause and died in silence. Yet the unique irony, the twist history rarely mentions, is that Nero achieved in death what he could never secure in life, a legacy impossible to bury. Every empire that rose after Rome studied his downfall, every ruler feared becoming him, every historian debated whether he was demon or fool, and every generation retold his final night with new layers of horror, pity, and fascination. In this strange immortality, born not from greatness but from infamy, Nero finally became what he had always desired, unforgettable.